They were praised as the greatest kings of the Islamic world. But behind the golden curtain of the Topkapi Palace, the Ottoman Sultans committed horrors against their slaves, acts so disturbing that even today, history still shudders when their names are spoken. It begins in the quiet hills of the Balkans. The year is the late 1500s. A small Christian village is winding down for the evening. Mothers call their children inside. Fathers return from the fields. The smell of bread drifts from stone ovens. On the surface, life is calm. But deep down, every family lives with a shadow, a terror that comes without warning. They call it the blood tax. One winter morning, the sound of hooves echoes through the valley. Ottoman riders, elite soldiers wearing dark cloaks, arrive at the edge of the village. The children scatter, but there is nowhere to hide. Mothers clutch their sons. Fathers step forward, powerless. The Sultan has given his order. Tonight, the tax will be collected. Devshirm. That word means nothing to outsiders. But to these villagers, it means everything. It means their sons will be taken. The soldiers move methodically, calling out the ages of the boys. 10, 11, 12, perfect. One soldier rips a boy from his mother's arms. She screams, clawing at his uniform, but the soldier pushes her into the dirt. Another father begs, offering his livestock, his last bag of coins. It doesn't matter. The boys are property now. One child, no older than 12, is dragged from the back of a barn. His name, at least the name he will soon be forced to forget, is Marco. He doesn't understand what's happening, only that his mother is crying, screaming his name, while strangers pull him away. Within hours, a line of boys stretches out of the village, bound together, guarded by horsemen. Some cry silently. Some stare blankly, already numb. Their families are left behind in ruins. They will never see each other again. The march is brutal. Days turn into weeks. The boys walk barefoot across frozen ground, fed scraps, beaten when they stumble. Along the way, some collapse and never rise again. The Ottomans don't stop. They just leave the bodies in the snow. When the survivors finally reach Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, their nightmare begins again. The boys are separated by strength, height, and appearance. The most promising are taken to the palace. There, they are forced to abandon their names, their language, even their faith. They are baptized not in water, but in fear, forced to recite Muslim prayers, beaten when they resist. Marco's name is gone. From now on, he will answer only to Mehmet. At first, he fights back. He refuses to pray. He spits at his captors. The punishment is swift, days locked in a dark cell, without food, until he breaks. When he finally gives in, they call it conversion. But in truth, it's the slow murder of his identity. Then comes the training. These boys are not free. They are being remade, body and soul, into janissaries, slave soldiers of the Sultan. Their heads are shaved, their clothes replaced with uniforms. They are drilled from dawn until nightfall, marching, swordplay, archery. Every movement is punished if imperfect. The smallest mistake is met with the whip. Marco, now Mehmet, watches as weaker boys collapse during training. Some die. Others vanish in the night, their bodies dumped in the Bosphorus. The survivors grow harder, colder, stripped of everything that once made them human. Years pass. Mehmet no longer remembers the sound of his mother's voice. He no longer remembers his village. The only family he knows now is the core, the janissaries. By the time he is 18, he is unrecognizable. He stands tall in gleaming armor, his eyes empty. When the Sultan commands war, Mehmet marches across Europe, not as a son, not as a villager, but as a weapon. And here is the most disturbing part. The janissaries became one of the most feared armies in the world. They were loyal, disciplined, nearly unstoppable. But behind their legendary reputation was a simple, horrifying truth. They were children, stolen from their homes, brainwashed, and turned into killing machines. For the Ottomans, Devshirm was a brilliant system of power. For the families of the Balkans, it was a living nightmare. Imagine it, every few years, hearing hooves at night, knowing they're coming for your son, knowing that by sunrise, he will be gone, knowing you will never see him again. And the boy himself? He would wake up years later, armored and armed, looking into the eyes of villagers just like his own parents, and slaughtering them in the Sultan's name. The blood tax didn't just steal children. It turned them into the very monsters that haunted their people. That was the true horror of Devshirme. If the blood tax tore boys from their homes, then the harem was its mirror image, the place where girls vanished into silk and shadows. From the outside, the Sultan's harem was a world of beauty. Marble courtyards, golden domes, fountains that never stopped flowing. Poets wrote about it as a paradise filled with laughter, music, and women dressed in jewels. But for those forced inside, it was no paradise. It was a prison. The girls came from everywhere: the mountains of Circassia, the coasts of Italy, the villages of Hungary. Some were bought at slave markets. Others were gifts from local governors, or war trophies carried back by soldiers. Most of them were just teenagers. Imagine being 16, torn from your family, placed on a ship to Istanbul, and told you would never leave. That was the reality for thousands of girls who entered the Sultan's harem. The first thing stripped from them was their name. An Italian girl might be renamed Aish. A Circassian girl might become Fatma. Their old lives, their language, their faith gone. They were now property of the Sultan. At first glance, life inside looked luxurious. The girls were given silk robes, jewels, and endless food. They lived in palaces with gardens and music. But the truth was darker. Every step, every breath, was controlled. Guards watched the corridors. Eunuchs, men who had been castrated as boys, patrolled day and night. No girl could leave. And if she displeased the wrong person, she could vanish overnight. One of the most infamous stories comes from Sultan Ibrahim I, known to history as Ibrahim the Mad. His paranoia was legendary. One day, convinced that his concubines were plotting against him, he ordered more than 200 women from his harem to be sewn into sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus Strait. Imagine the screams in the night, the splashing water, then silence. By morning, the gardens of Topkapi were quiet again, only emptier. But the horror wasn't always so dramatic. Sometimes it was slower, quieter. A girl who caught the Sultan's eye might rise to power. She might bear a son, or even become his favorite. But those who failed, they might spend their entire lives locked in a gilded cage, waiting in vain for a call that never came. And rivalry was everywhere. The women of the harem weren't just slaves. They were pawns in a brutal game of politics. Mothers plotted to have their sons declared heir. Concubines whispered against each other, hoping to climb higher. Betrayals happened in the shadows. Poisoned drinks, silken cords slipped around necks in the dark. To outsiders, the harem was exotic fantasy. To insiders, it was survival of the cruelest. Consider this. Some concubines who fell out of favor weren't killed. Instead, they were sold back into the slave markets, discarded like broken toys. Imagine living in palaces, dressed in gold, only to be dragged away and sold to a stranger because you were no longer useful. Even for those who became powerful, the cost was steep. Take Hurrem Sultan, perhaps the most famous woman in Ottoman history. She rose from a slave girl to the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. But her path to power was paved with blood. Rivals mysteriously disappeared. Alliances shattered. The palace whispered her name like a curse. The system itself was designed for cruelty. Girls were chosen, tested, discarded. Their bodies were currency, their lives entertainment, their futures decided by the whim of a single man. To the outside world, the harem symbolized the empire's glory. But to the women inside, it was held behind marble walls. Picture it. 1,000 women locked in endless corridors, each one desperate for survival. Some sang to hide their fear. Some plotted. Some simply prayed for death. And every night, when the Sultan's eunuchs walked the halls with lanterns, hearts froze. Because no one knew whose door would open next. The Sultan's choice could mean life, or a silken death. And that was the true horror of the harem. If the Devshirme tore boys from their homes, if the harem trapped girls behind golden walls, then execution was the final horror. Inside the Ottoman palace, death had its own ritual. The Sultan was absolute. His word was law. And when he decided someone had to die, the method was almost always the same: strangulation by silk cord. Why silk? because spilling royal blood was forbidden. For a sultan, or a prince, or even a high-ranking slave, death had to be clean. No axe, no blade, no blood. Instead, the victim was dragged into a quiet chamber, handed over to the palace executioners, usually mute eunuchs, trained for this very moment. The condemned was forced to kneel. Behind him, two men pulled tight a long cord of silk, soft to the touch, beautiful in the light, but deadly in silence. The strangulation was quick, but not instant. The victim's body thrashed, heels scraping against the marble floors. Eyes bulged, face turned purple. Then, finally, stillness. And just like that, the empire moved on. This method was used countless times. Viziers who lost favor, generals accused of treachery, concubines who whispered the wrong words, even princes, sons of the sultan himself. Perhaps the darkest example was the ritual of fratricide. To prevent civil war, new sultans often executed their brothers the moment they took the throne. Dozens of young princes, some just children, were strangled with silk cords the same day their brother was crowned. Imagine it, a celebration in the streets, fireworks and music, while in the palace, the sultan's own brothers gasped their last breaths in silence. The silk cord became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of fear. Everyone in the palace lived with it hanging over their heads. At night, when footsteps echoed in the corridor, hearts froze, because no one knew when the executioners might knock. And for the slaves of the Ottoman Empire, this was the ultimate reminder. Their lives were not their own. They could be stolen in an instant, as quietly as silk slipping through fingers. The Ottomans left behind monuments, mosques, and empires carved across continents. But beneath the marble and gold was another legacy, of children stolen, women caged, and lives ended in silence. History remembers the sultans as magnificent rulers, but the truth, hidden behind the palace walls, is far more terrifying. Inside the Ottoman court, death was never loud. It was silent, almost elegant. For those who displeased the sultan, slaves, viziers, generals, even princes, there was no trial, no debate. There was only the cord, a cord of silk. To outsiders, it sounded almost gentle. Silk, after all, was soft, smooth, a fabric of luxury. But in the palace, everyone knew what it meant. When the mute eunuchs appeared at your chamber door, carrying a folded length of silk, your fate was sealed. The condemned was led into a quiet room, far from the music of the court. Marble walls, oil lamps flickering. No crowds, no spectacle. This was not execution as punishment. It was execution as ritual. The victim was forced to kneel. Behind him, two executioners held the cord. They wrapped it around his neck, then pulled. Slowly, relentlessly. No blood spilled. That was the point. For centuries, Ottoman law held that royal blood could not be shed. So the strangulation became their answer. Death without blood, silence instead of screams. But silence didn't mean peace. The body convulsed. Fingers clawed at the air. Heels scraped against the marble floor. Eyes bulged, lips turned blue. It could take minutes before the body finally went limp. In those minutes, the condemned lived through a horror worse than the sword. A sword is quick. Silk is slow. And yet, to the Ottomans, it was merciful. A clean death. A noble death. Even a beautiful death. The truth was far darker. This method was not reserved for criminals alone. Princes, the Sultan's own brothers and sons, often met this fate. Under the brutal practice of fratricide, a new sultan would secure his throne by ordering all of his brothers strangled. Some were still children. Imagine it. A coronation above, music and fireworks in the streets, while below, in the shadows of the palace, the sultan's brothers were being silenced one by one. One cord, many throats. And when it was done, the silk was folded away, spotless, ready for the next. Everyone inside the Topkapi Palace lived with that fear. At night, footsteps in the corridor could freeze your blood, because when the eunuchs knocked, no one resisted. Resistance was useless. The cord always won. For the Ottomans, the silk cord was more than an execution tool. It was a symbol of power, a reminder that the sultan's will was absolute, and that life at court could be taken away as easily as breath. No blood, No noise. Just silence. That was the true horror of the silk cord. History remembers the Ottoman Sultans as magnificent rulers, builders of mosques, conquerors of empires, patrons of art and science. Their names are etched in stone, their legacies carved across continents. But behind the gold, behind the marble, was something else. Boys torn from their families, reshaped into weapons. Girls stolen from their homes, locked in gilded prisons. Princes and slaves alike, strangled in silence by a silk cord. The empire thrived on this hidden machinery of fear and blood. And yet, for centuries, the outside world saw only the glittering surface, the palaces, the victories, the glory. But if you step into those same corridors at night, what do you hear? Is it the echo of footsteps racing down the stone halls? The muffled cries of mothers watching their sons disappear into the dark? The splash of sacks sinking beneath the Bosphorus? Or maybe just the whisper of silk tightening around a final breath? Because the truth is, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just built on armies and laws. It was built on people, broken, silenced, erased. And that leaves us with a question. When we celebrate the greatness of history, are we also willing to face its horrors? Or do we, like the empire itself, hide them behind a curtain of gold?